You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. As well, you can hear these podcasts at RudolfSteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. There are two publishing houses, SteinerBooks.org in America and RudolfSteinerPress.com in England, which are the sole publishers of Steiner into English and have given me permission to do these recordings. Please consider patronizing them as well. This is a reading of the Collected Works, Volume 155 by Rudolf Steiner, entitled Christ and the Human Soul, composed of 3 sections. The first of 2 lectures is The Meaning of Life. The second, I believe, is 4 lectures entitled The Spiritual Foundation of Morality. And the rest of the lectures are entitled Anthroposophy and Christianity. And that's 10 lectures in total, translated by Agnes Schneeberg de Stoor. Lecture 1 is given in Copenhagen on May 23, 1912. In these 2 evening lectures, I would like to speak to you from the viewpoint of spiritual research about a question people ask repeatedly and deliberately about the question, what is the meaning of life? If in these 2 evenings we are to draw near to what can be said about this meaning of life, then we shall first have to create a kind of foundation, a kind of basis on which we can build the edifice of knowledge, as it were, that will provide an answer to our question, even if only a brief and sketch-like one. When we initially contemplate the things around us, things that are present in everyday life and can be observed through the senses, and then turn to look at our own life, we can at best only come to the formulation of a question, a difficult, puzzling, disquieting question. We see how the creatures of external nature come into being and die away. Every year in spring, we can observe how the earth, stimulated by the forces of sun and cosmos, bestows on us the plants that sprout and blossom, bearing fruit throughout the summer. As autumn approaches, we see how these creations decay and fade away again. Some indeed remain with us for several years, some for very many years, such as our long-lived trees. But even if, in many cases, they may outlive us, we know that they also pass away, disappear, sink down into that part of the great natural world that is the realm of the lifeless. We know above all that growth and decay govern even the greatest phenomena of nature. We know that even the continents that provide the foundation for our developing civilizations have not always existed in times past, for they have only arisen in the course of time, and we know for sure that they will one day lie in ruins. All around us, then, we see growth and decay. We can observe it, this growth and decay, in the plant and mineral kingdoms and also in the animal kingdom. What is the meaning of it all? All around us, there is always something coming into being, always something decaying. What is the meaning of this becoming and this fading away? When we contemplate our own life and observe how we have lived through the years and decades, we can recognize that there too we have seen this growth and decay. When we think about our early childhood, we find that it has vanished and has left only memories behind. And what remains as memories can actually give rise to anxious questions about our life. Having undertaken one thing or another, we ask, what did it lead to? What has resulted from my having done it? The most important thing is that we shall have progressed somewhat, that we shall have learned something as a result of it. What usually happens, however, is that only after we have done it do we realize how it ought to have been done. It is only when we are no longer in a position to do something about it that we know how much better it might have been done, so that our mistakes actually become a part of our life. But it is precisely through our mistakes and errors that we gain our most wide-ranging experiences. A question confronts us, and it seems as if what we can capture through our senses and comprehend with our intellect cannot provide us with an answer. This is the position we human beings are in today. Everything that surrounds us presents us with a perturbing problem, with the question, what is the meaning of the whole of existence? And particularly also the question, why have we human beings been placed into this existence in the way we have? This is the question that initially presents itself to us. A most interesting legend of Hebrew antiquity tells how in this old Hebrew civilization there was an awareness that this perturbing question, the question we described regarding the meaning of life, and especially the meaning of being human, occurs not only to human beings, but to other beings as well. This legend is inordinately instructive and runs as follows. When the Elohim were preparing to create the human being in their own image and likeness, beings called ministering angels, that is, spiritual beings ranked lower than the Elohim themselves, asked Yahweh or Jehovah, quote, why are human beings to be made in the image and likeness of God, close quote. Then, so the legend continues, Yahweh gathered the animals and the plants that had already sprung forth on earth before human beings existed in their earthly form, and he also gathered the angels, the ministering angels, those in his immediate service. He showed them the animals and plants and asked them what these animals and plants were called, what their names were. But the angels did not know the names of the animals, nor did they know the names of the plants. Then the human being was created, as he was before the fall. And again Yahweh gathered the angels and also the animals and plants, and having instructed the animals to pass by in succession for the human being to see, Yahweh asked the human being in the presence of the angels what the names were of the animals, what they were called. And, lo and behold, the human being was able to answer, quote, this animal has this name, that animal has that name, this plant has this name, that plant has that name, close quote. Then Yahweh or Jehovah asked the human being, quote, and what is your own name, close quote. And the human being said, quote, I must actually be called Adam, close quote. Parenthesis, Adam is related to Adama, meaning from earthly mud, creature of the earth. This is the translation, in quotes, of Adam, close parentheses. Yahweh then continued, asking the human being, quote, and what shall I myself be called? Close quote. The human being replied, quote, you shall be called Adonai. You are the Lord of all created beings on the earth. Close quote. Now the angels had an idea of the meaning of human existence on the earth. Religious traditions and religious writings often express the most important of life's riddles in the simplest terms. Yet there are many difficulties in understanding them. For we must first learn to recognize what lies behind their simplicity. If we succeed in doing so, great wisdom and deep knowledge are revealed, as will also be the case with this legend. For now we shall simply keep it in mind, for these two lectures will give us, in one form or another, an answer to the questions it raises. Now, you know that there is a religion that has put the question about the meaning and value of life by placing it in a staggeringly wonderful form into the very mouth of its own founder. You all know the stories of the Buddha that indicate how he left the palace in which he was born, how he came face to face with the real facts of life, of which in that incarnation he had as yet no inkling, while still in the palace, and how he was most deeply dismayed about life and pronounced the judgment, in quotes, life is suffering. This declaration, as we know, comprises four elements. Quote, birth is suffering, illness is suffering, old age is suffering, death is suffering, close quote, to which are then added, quote, to be united with those we do not love is suffering. To be separated from those we love is suffering. Not to be able to achieve the things we aim for is suffering, close quote. And we also know that for those observing this religion, the meaning of life can then be captured in the words, quote, life, which is suffering, only acquires meaning if it is overcome, if it is transcended, close quote. In essence, all the various religions, and also all philosophies and views of life, are attempts to answer the question, what is the meaning of life? Now, rather than approach this question in a philosophically abstract manner, we shall here review some of the phenomena of life, some of the realities of life, from a more esoteric point of view. We shall endeavor to look more deeply into these facts in order to discover whether a more profound, a more spiritual view of life can bring us something that can help answer this question regarding the meaning of life. Let us take up our subject again at the point where we spoke of the annual growth and decay in sense-perceptible nature, of the life, growth, and decay in the plant kingdom. In spring, we see the plants sprouting up out of the earth, and all this germinating, budding life calls forth our joy and delight. We become aware that the whole of our existence is bound up with the plant world, for without it we could not exist. We sense that everything springing up from the earth at the approach of summer is related to our own life, and how in the autumn that which in a certain sense belongs to us is fading away again. It is quite natural to compare our own life with the growth and decay we observe around us. To external observation, based solely on what can be perceived by the senses and judged by the intellect, it is quite natural to compare the vernal sprouting of the plants out of the earth with our waking up in the morning, and the autumnal withering and decaying of the plant world with our falling asleep in the evening. But such a comparison would be quite superficial, because it would leave out of account the real circumstances which can be grasped by means of even the more elementary truths of esoteric science. What happens when we fall asleep at night? We know that we leave our physical body and etheric body behind in bed, and that with our astral body and our I, capital, we withdraw from our physical and etheric bodies. During the night, between our falling asleep and our waking up, we are in a world of spirit with our astral body and our I. From this spiritual world, we gather the forces we need. However, it is not only our astral body and our I, but also our physical body and our etheric body that undergo a kind of restorative process, a regeneration, as they lie in bed, separated from the astral body and the I during our sleep at night. If with clairvoyant vision one looks down from the I and the astral body to the etheric body and the physical body, one can see what has been destroyed by our daytime life. One sees that what expresses itself as fatigue is actually a destructive process, and that it is restored during the night. As a matter of fact, our conscious daytime life as a whole, seen in its connection with human consciousness and in its relation to the physical body and the etheric body, is actually a kind of destructive process with respect to the physical and etheric bodies. We always destroy something with our consciousness. And this fact, the fact that we destroy something, manifests as tiredness. What has been destroyed is restored again during the night. Now, if one looks at what happens when we have departed with our astral body and I from the etheric and physical bodies, then it is as if we left behind a field laid waste. But the moment we have gone, the moment we have left the physical and etheric bodies, this field gradually begins to restore itself. It is then as if the forces belonging to the physical and etheric bodies were beginning to bloom and sprout, and as if a whole vegetation were arising on the scene of destruction. The further the night advances and the longer we sleep, the more does the budding and sprouting continue in our etheric body. The closer we get to morning, and the more we enter our physical and etheric bodies again with our astral body, the more does a kind of withering and wilting begin again with respect to our physical and etheric bodies. In short, when the I and astral body look down from the spiritual world on our physical and etheric bodies as we go to sleep at night, they see the same manifestation as the one we observe in the great world outside, when the plants germinate and sprout in spring. Therefore, if we want to make a true comparison, one that is more on an intimate level, then we must compare our falling asleep and the earlier part of our sleeping state at night with springtime in nature, and the time of our waking up, the time when our I and the astral body are entering the physical and etheric bodies again, with autumn in nature. This, not the opposite, is the correct comparison to draw. The opposite one is drawn from an external point of view. In human beings, springtime corresponds to falling asleep, and autumn to waking up. But how does this matter appear when a clairvoyant observer, someone who can truly look into the spiritual world, directs his gaze to external nature and observes what takes place there in the course of the year? What then presents itself to spiritual vision teaches us that we must not compare things in an outer, but rather in an inner sense. What clairvoyant observation shows is that just as the physical and etheric bodies of the human being are connected with the astral body and the eye, so the earth is connected with what we call its spiritual aspect. The earth too is a body, a vast body, and looking at it only in relation to its physical part is like looking at a human being only in relation to the physical body. We only see the earth in its completeness when we regard it as the body of spiritual beings. Just as in the case of the human being, we see the spirit as belonging to the body. There is, however, one difference. A human being is a single, unified entity governing the physical and etheric bodies. A single, unified soul and spirit entity is connected with the human physical and etheric bodies. But there are a great many spirits belonging to the earth's body. The sole spiritual element in the human being is a unity, whereas with respect to the earth, it is a multiplicity. This is the most obvious distinction. Having acknowledged this difference, we shall find everything else, in a certain sense, analogous. What spiritual vision observes in spring is that the earth spirits, for this is what we call them, withdraw from the earth to the same degree as the plants sprout forth from the earth and greenery spreads. But again, it is not quite the same as with the human being, for rather than withdrawing completely, as is the case with the human spirit, the earth spirits reposition themselves, in a certain sense moving around to the other side of the earth. When it is summer in one hemisphere, it is winter in the other. What happens is that the spirit and soul part of the earth moves from the northern to the southern hemisphere when summer is approaching in the north. That does not alter the fact, however, that a clairvoyant observer experiencing springtime anywhere on the globe sees the spirits withdrawing from the earth. He observes how these spirits rise up and move out into the cosmos. Rather than seeing them move to the other side, he sees them withdrawing. Just as he sees the I departing together with the astral body when a human being falls asleep, just in that same way, the clairvoyant observer sees the earth spirits departing from what they had been tied to, bound up with. During the winter, when the earth is covered in ice and snow, the spirit forces are directly united with the earth. During the autumn, the opposite occurs. Then clairvoyant vision sees the earth spirits approaching and reuniting with the earth. In actual fact, something then arises in the earth that resembles what takes place in a human being, namely a kind of self-consciousness. During the summer, the spiritual part of the earth knows nothing of what goes on around it in the cosmos. But in winter, the spirit of the earth knows what is occurring all around it in the cosmos, just as a human being on waking up knows and sees what is taking place around him or her. The analogy is entirely valid, except that it is the reverse of what outer consciousness comes to. However, if we want to consider this matter in its entirety, we cannot simply say, quote, when the plants sprout and burst forth from the earth in spring, the earth spirits depart, close quote. For in fact, with the budding and sprouting of the plants, mightier spirits rise up as though out of the depths, out of the interior of the earth. Consequently, the mythologies were right to distinguish between the higher and the nether gods, And when people spoke of the gods who leave the earth in spring and return in autumn, they meant the higher gods. But there are mightier, older gods. The Greeks called them the chthonic gods. Reader's aside, spelled Chthonic, chthonic gods. End of reader's aside. These arise in summer, when everything is budding and sprouting, and they sink down again in winter, when the real earth spirits unite once more with the body of the earth. These are the facts. And I would now like to mention that a certain idea taken from spiritual nature research is of immense importance for our lives as human beings. For this research reveals that when we consider an individual human being, we actually have something before us that is like an image of the great earth being itself. What do we see when we observe the plants as they begin to bud and sprout? We see exactly the same as what is taking place within the human being while asleep. We see how the one corresponds exactly with the other, how individual plants are related to the human body, what their significance is for the human body. This can only be recognized when such connections are understood. For it is indeed a fact, if one watches closely as a human being goes to sleep, one sees how everything begins to bud and sprout in his physical body and his etheric body, how a whole vegetation springs up in him, and how the human being is in truth a tree or a garden with plants growing in it. Someone following this with clairvoyant vision sees how the sprouting and budding within the human being corresponds to what is sprouting and budding in outer nature. And so you may be able to form a picture of what may come about in the future when spiritual science, which for the most part is still regarded as nonsense today, is applied to life and made fruitful. Let us take the example of a person in whom some life processes are not functioning properly. Then let us observe, when this person falls asleep, which kinds of plant are missing, when his physical and etheric bodies begin to unfold their vegetative growth. Now, when we turn to the earth and notice that whole species of plants are absent at some location on the earth, we know that something must be wrong with the life being of the earth. And it is the same when certain plants are missing in a person's physical and etheric bodies. In order to remedy the deficiency in that person, we need only search on the earth for the plants that are missing in the person in question and use their juices either in dietary form or as medicine. We shall then, from their innate forces, find the relationship between medicine and illness. This example shows us how spiritual science will be able to intervene directly in life, although at present we are only at the beginning of these things. With this example I have given you, in the form of a comparison, some nature-inspired thoughts about how human beings, through their whole essential makeup, are related to the environment in which they are placed. Let us now look at the matter from a spiritual point of view. And here I would like to begin by calling attention to something rather important. In its endeavors to decipher the meaning of life, spiritual science provides a view of the evolution of humanity from the esoteric perspective, without according any outer preference to one particular creed or worldview over another. Within our spiritual movement, it has often been emphasized that we can identify what our earthly humanity experienced and developed immediately after the great Atlantean catastrophe had befallen the earth. The first great post-Atlantean civilization we then come across is the ancient sacred culture of India. Here in your city, we have already spoken about this too, stressing the exaltedness of this sacred Indian culture by pointing out that what has survived in the Vedas or in other written traditions are merely echoes of it. It is only in the Akashic record that we can catch a glimpse of the primeval teachings that issued forth from that time. There we look upon heights never since regained. The subsequent cultural epochs have quite different tasks. We also know that a descent has taken place since then, that there will be a new ascent, and, as already mentioned, that spiritual science has the task to prepare for this ascent. We know that in the seventh post-Atlantean cultural epoch, there will be a kind of renewal of the ancient sacred Indian civilization. In this sense, then, we do not give preference to any religious view or creed, for all are measured with the same yardstick. Each one is described in all its characteristics, and the deeper truths in all of them are sought. The important thing is to focus on the essentials. We must not allow ourselves to stray off course in contemplating the essential nature of every religious creed. And if we keep this in mind in approaching the various worldviews, we can identify one fundamental difference. We recognize that there are worldviews of a more Eastern nature and others that have permeated the cultures of the West. Once we clearly identify this difference, we will find that it provides insights into the meaning of existence. We discover that the ancients already had something which will cause us a considerable effort to regain, namely, teachings about reincarnation. The Eastern streams possessed this knowledge as something springing from the profoundest depths of existence. You can still see how these Oriental streams shape their whole life on the basis of these teachings. When you look at the relationship Oriental people have with their bodhisattvas and their Buddhas. If you keep in view how reluctant Oriental people are to select any one single figure with a definite name as the ruling power in human evolution, then you understand at once how they attach much greater importance to focusing on the individuality who passes from one life to the next. Orientalists say that there is such and such a number of bodhisattvas, high beings who sprang from humanity and then gradually evolved to an exaltedness that can be described by saying, quote, a being has lived through many incarnations and then become a bodhisattva, as did Gautama, the son of King Suddhodana. He was a bodhisattva and then became a Buddha, close quote. The name Buddha, however, is given to many after they have lived through many incarnations, then become a bodhisattva, and thereafter ascend to the next stage of eminence, that of a Buddha. The name Buddha is a general designation. It denotes a degree of human worthiness and is meaningless without taking into account the being of spirit and soul who has lived through many incarnations. Brahmanism fully agrees with Buddhism in that it focuses on the individuality who lives through the many successive personalities rather than on the single personalities. For it amounts to the same thing whether a Buddhist says, quote, a bodhisattva is destined to ascend to the highest possible degree of human worthiness and has to live through many incarnations in order to attain it. And for me, the highest is the Buddha, close quote. Or whether the adherent of Brahmanism says, quote, the bodhisattvas are indeed highly developed beings who ascend to Buddhahood, but they spring from the avatars, who are higher spiritual individualities, close quote. For you see, what is inherent in both these Eastern points of view is the knowledge of a spiritual entity who lives through many incarnations. Now let us look at the West and see who are considered the great and mighty there. In order to gain a deeper insight into this, we have to consider the ancient Hebrew point of view and consider the personal element. When we speak of Plato, Socrates, Michelangelo, Charlemagne, or others, we are always speaking of a person. We point to the well-defined life of a personality and what that personality represented for humanity. In our Western culture, we do not focus on a life that has moved on from person to person, for it has been the task of Western culture, at least for a time, to pay attention to the single earth life. When people speak of a Buddha in the East, it is understood that the designation, in quotes, Buddha, is a title of eminence applicable to many personalities. But when the name Plato is spoken of, we know that this designates a single personality. This has been the education in the West, where, to begin with, the personal aspect had to be esteemed and respected. Now, let us take a look at our own time. How should we evaluate this whole sequence of events today? For a certain period of time, Western culture has trained humanity to pay attention to the personality. But now the time has come to augment the personal element with the individual aspect, with the individuality. We must reclaim the individual element, but now strengthened, enlivened by an understanding of the personal. Let us take a specific case, and in this connection, begin by looking back to the ancient Hebrew worldview that preceded the Western view of the world. Consider a mighty personality, such as the prophet Elijah, 1 Kings 17 to 2 Kings 2:14. We may indeed initially describe him as personality, for in the West he is seldom regarded in any other way. If we look at the personality as such, leaving all details aside, we see Elijah as being very important in world evolution. He gives the impression of something like a forerunner of the Christ impulse. Looking back to the time of Moses, we see something being foretold to the people. We see the God in man being proclaimed. Quote, I, the God who was, who is, and who shall be, close quote. In the I, capital, he must be grasped. But among the ancient Israelites, he was perceived as the folk soul of the people. Elijah went beyond that. He could not yet make it clear that the I lives in a single human individuality as the highest divinity. For he could not elucidate more to the people of his time than the world was ready to receive. Nevertheless, it can be seen as a forward leap in evolution. Whereas the Mosaic culture of the ancient Israelites was conscious of the fact that, quote, the highest lies in the I, close quote, and this I found expression in the folk soul of the people in the time of Moses, we find Elijah already pointing to the individual human soul. But a further impulse was needed, and once more we see a kind of forerunner appearing in the personality of John the Baptist. And again, it was in significant words that the forerunner quality of John the Baptist found expression. What do these words mean? An important esoteric fact is indicated by these words. They express the fact that human beings, once as primordial humanity, possessed an ancient clairvoyance which enabled them to look into the spiritual world, into divine activity. Then, however, they turned more toward the material world, and the ability to see into the spiritual world was closed off. John the Baptist alludes to this fact when he says, quote, change the attitude of your soul. Look no longer to what you can gain in the physical world. Be watchful. A new impulse, close quote, he meant the Christ impulse, continue quote, is at hand. Therefore I say unto you, seek the spiritual world in your very midst, close quote. This is where the spiritual element enters, with the Christ impulse. And with these words, John the Baptist became a forerunner of the Christ impulse. Now we turn our attention to another personality, to the remarkable personality of the painter Raphael, who upon some reflection appears unusual to us. We need only compare Raphael as a painter of the Italian people with painters of a later period. For example, Titian. Anyone with an eye for such things, even with only reproductions available for comparison, will soon discover the difference. Look at Raphael's paintings and at Titian's paintings. Raphael painted in such a way that he put Christian ideas into his pictures. He painted for European people as Western Christians. His pictures are comprehensible to all Western Christians and will become more so as time goes on. Compare this with the later painters who painted almost exclusively for the Roman Latin people, so that even the schisms of the church found expression in their pictures. Which were Raphael's most successful paintings? The ones in which he was able to proclaim the impulses inherent in Christianity, where he was able to express some aspects of the relationship of the Jesus child to the Madonna, where he was able to present the Christ relationship to the Madonna as something that is an impulsive feeling. That is where he is at his best. These are also essentially the things he painted best. We do not have a crucifixion by him, for example, but there is a transfiguration. Wherever he could paint the budding, the germinating aspects, the things to be proclaimed, there he painted with joy and made his greatest and best pictures. It is essentially the same with the effect his pictures produce. If you have a chance to come to Germany someday and see the Sistine Madonna in Dresden, it is even said that Germans may rejoice to have such a celebrated painting in their midst, one which may actually be regarded as the flower of the art of painting. Then you will realize that this work of art reveals a mystery of existence. Goethe, in his time, having traveled from Leipzig to Dresden, heard something quite different about the painting of the Madonna. Officials at the Dresden Art Gallery said something like this to him, quote, "One of the pictures we have is by Raphael, but it is nothing special. It is badly painted. The child's glance, actually the whole child itself, everything about it is common." The same has to be said about the Madonna. One can only assume that a dauber painted her. And then there are these figures at the bottom. One can't tell whether they are meant to be children's heads or angels. Close quote. This uncouth opinion is what Goethe heard at that time, so that initially he failed to appreciate the painting properly. Everything we now hear about the picture was not commonly acknowledged until later, and the fact that reproductions of Raphael's pictures began their triumphal march around the globe is a direct result of this new appreciation. We need only call to mind what England in particular has done for the reproduction and circulation of Raphael's pictures. However, the real outcome of the efforts made in England with respect to reproducing and circulating Raphael's pictures will only be recognized when people have learned to look at these things more from the point of view of spiritual science. And so through his pictures, Raphael can be seen as an early forerunner of a Christianity that will become cosmopolitan. For a long time, Protestantism speculatively regarded the Madonna as something specifically Catholic. But today, the Madonna has permeated all the Protestant countries too, as we rise to a more spiritual interpretation, to a higher interdenominational Christianity. This will more and more be the case, and if we may hope for such results in the realm of interdenominational Christianity, then what Raphael has done will also benefit the realm of spiritual science. Remarkably, we have now encountered three personalities, and all three have something of the quality of being a forerunner of Christianity. Let us now look at these three personalities with a spiritual view. What does it teach us? Spiritual observation teaches us that the same individuality lived in Elijah, in John the Baptist, and in Raphael. However impossible it may seem, it was the same soul who lived in Elijah, in John the Baptist, and in Raphael. When spiritual observation, through investigative research, not outer theoretical comparisons, reveals that it is the same soul who is present in Elijah, in John the Baptist, and in Raphael, we now have to ask, how can it be that Raphael the painter became the vehicle of the individuality who had lived in John the Baptist? Can we imagine that the remarkable soul of John the Baptist lived in the forces that existed in Raphael? Again, esoteric research can come in here, in such a way, however, that it does not merely put theories out into the world, but that it describes things as they really are, as they are embedded in life. How do people write biographies of Raphael today? Even the best, this can be seen anywhere, simply mention that Raphael was born on Good Friday of the year 1483. Yet it is not for nothing that Raphael was born on a Good Friday. Even this birth date proclaims his exceptional position in Christianity, showing how profoundly and significantly he is connected with the Christian mysteries. It was on a Good Friday, then, that Raphael was born. His father was Giovanni Santi. He died when Raphael was 11 years old. When he was 8 years old, his father apprenticed him to a painter who was, however, not of any special eminence. But if one realizes what lived in Giovanni Santi, Raphael's father, one receives a particular impression that is further strengthened when the matter is investigated in the Akashic records. What becomes apparent then is that much more lived in the soul of Giovanni Santi than he was able to express as a personality. Thus we can agree with the Duchess who spoke these words at the time of his death. Quote, "A man full of light and truth and purest faith has died." Close quote. As a spiritual researcher, one can say that a far greater painter lived in him than could come into full effect outwardly. His outer capacities, those dependent on his physical and etheric organs, were not developed in Giovanni Santi. For that reason, he could not bring the capabilities of his soul to full expression, although a truly great painter lived in his soul. Giovanni Santi died when Raphael was 11 years old. Now, if one investigates these circumstances, then one sees how true it is that although the human body is lost at death, the longings, the aspirations, the impulses of the soul continue to exist and continue to be active where they have the closest connections. A time will come when spiritual science will be made fruitful for life, as it can already be made fruitful today by those who have made this knowledge alive in themselves and have not really grasped it theoretically. Permit me to interpolate something here before continuing with Raphael. The examples I give do not involve mere speculation. On the contrary, they are always taken from life itself. Suppose you have children to bring up. If you watch the children's capabilities, you soon notice the individual element in each child. But such things can really only be noticed by the person bringing up the children. Now, if a child's mother or father dies while the child is still young, leaving only one parent still living, one may notice that certain inclinations become apparent in the child that were not there before and are therefore difficult to explain. But if we are educating children, we have to concern ourselves with such things, and would do well to say to ourselves, quote, "Even though people generally consider the content of spiritual scientific books as foolishness, I will endeavor not to take it as such, but rather keep an open mind and explore whether it might be correct after all." Close quote. Looking at things in this way, we would soon discover that some forces were already there in the child, and that other forces are now working into those the child already had. Let us suppose then that once the father has passed through the gate of death, certain qualities that had lived in him now begin to show up in the child with a certain intensity. If we make this assumption and look upon the matter in this way, then we will have applied insights coming to us through spiritual science in a sensible way. And as we will soon discover, we will then be able to find our way in life, whereas before we did not. So the one who has gone through the gate of death remains united through his forces with those who were close to him in life. People do not observe things closely enough. Otherwise they would notice more frequently the children change after the death of their parents, that they are very different from how they were before. Not enough attention is paid to these things at present, but a time will come when people will notice these things. Let us now look at Raphael again. Giovanni Santi, the father, died when Raphael was 11 years old. And even though the father had not achieved any special perfection as a painter, a powerful imagination remained his, and this then permeated the soul of Raphael and was further developed there. Having observed this soul, we do not belittle or undervalue Raphael. If we say that Giovanni Santi lived on in Raphael's soul, and that this is why Raphael appears to us as someone whose personality has reached completion, as someone incapable of reaching any higher, because a man who has died gave life to his works. We now understand, since the vibrant forces of John the Baptist are reborn in Raphael's own soul, and the forces of Giovanni Santi now also live in his soul, that these two elements together were able to bring about the result that stands before us as Raphael. It is true